suffer, we experience, we have emotions which express through our body. We are shy, we are not shy, we are confident, we show our class, caste, racial privilege through the way we move around. And if you look at somebody like Bourdieu, the idea of habitus, and the question of bodily importance became very important with the influence of phenomenological approaches. But they have also greatly contributed to lived experience, to our everyday lives, how we live, how we think, how we suffer, how we express our joy, to our illness, to our healing, to suffering, to violence, to morality, to bodiliness, sensory perception, consciousness, aesthetic effects, subjectivity, intersubjectivity. These are areas where phenomenology has had an enormous influence. Before I go on to the question about what exactly, where do we start? At the starting point, a lot of scholars have suggested, is the structure of consciousness as experienced from the first person point of view. The central structure, the philosophers of phenomenology would argue, of an experience is its intentionality. It is directed towards something, as it is an experience of or about some object. An experience is directed towards an object by virtue of its content or meaning, which represents the object together with appropriate enabling condition. I'll go back to what seems to be a little complicated definition. First, let's look at the question of experience. Experience seems to be something very central to the phenomenological perspective and from the first person point of view. That is, for example, I am giving a talk right away on phenomenology to a large audience whom I do not know at all, who I know technically only from the chat books that so many people have joined in. Now, from my first person point of view, is this first person point of view or my subjective awareness or subjective experience completely random? Is it something completely individual, something which belongs to me? And as a sociologist, or even as somebody who has some familiarity with what phenomenologists are talking about, I would argue not at all. It is, in fact, my experience is a social experience felt by myself, definitely, but it is socially learned. So if you look at somebody's writing like Mead, Mind, Self, and Society, the idea of symbolic interactionism or interactionism, that as individuals, as human beings, how do I learn how to experience? This experience, I feel, is important to realize, is socially learned. It's not an individual completely disconnected with other individual experience. This is a social experience felt by the individual. Therefore, very often in textbooks of sociology, you begin with the story of the wolf child. The wolf child was a baby which was picked up by the wolves and brought up among the wolves. And that child, when it was discovered, was brought back to the human world. But that wolf child never learned how to stand and walk on its feet. It crawled like other wolves, did not know how to speak a language because language is socially learnt, and did not know how to communicate with the human world because the communication of that wolf child was restricted to the wolf world. In other words, that child was not a human being socially, because it's not just the biological embodiments, but the way the biology or the body reacts to the social which constitutes the body. What is our notion of, say, shame? What is our notion of pride? How do we conduct ourselves? How is a girl in a patriarchal society supposed to conduct her bodily embodiments or deportment? All this is socially learned. So when we talk about structures of consciousness as experienced from the first person point of view, it's important to bring in the first person. Important to bring in the subjectivity, but that subjectivity is not disconnected with the other subjectivities, because this is the intersubjective world within which we inhabit. That is why I know that when I'm speaking on phenomenology to scholars across the world and in our country, they are also oriented or have some familiarity with what I'm talking about. They know the code of conduct expected in an online lecture. They know how to be audible, how to make themselves invisible. There is, in a certain sense, a stock of knowledge which is commonly shared and socially constructed. So, very often, when young people are often assumed that positivism is only talking about the objective world, phenomenology is talking only about the subjective world. This is a binary that should be dispensed with and rejected, because it is the dialectical relationship between the subjective and the objective which creates the intersubjectivity. The objective world is given meaning through our social lives. So, supposing, say, if you look at caste Hinduism, where the ideas of purity and pollution existed, an area which a lot of sociologists studied about, it is how we define an object. How do we decide a particular object is impure, and how do we decide it is pure? It is socially constituted. So, questions of caste hierarchy, structural relationships which are objective and exist in society outside us, but bear upon and imprint on us in our subjective feelings, then that is connected. So, if a vegetarian person is completely violated by the smell of non vegetarian, it is a learned process. It is not something which is given there in the objectivity of the non vegetarian item itself. As a Bengali, I am tempted to have fish. When somebody cooks fish, I am excited. It doesn't exist in the fish itself. It is the meaning I attribute to it, but that meaning is not individual. It is intersubjective, and it is something which we have learned. So when we talk about structure of consciousness or structure of meaning, when we study a particular phenomena, remember the sociological nature of experience. It is very important to do that. Otherwise, we will get caught in the idea that phenomenology is about something particularly about the individual's subjectivity. In recent philosophy of the mind, the term phenomenology is often restricted to the characterization of sensory qualities, of seeing, of hearing, what it is like to have sensations of various kinds. However, our experience is much richer in content than mere sensation. Accordingly, in the phenomenological tradition, phenomenology is given a much wider range, addressing the meaning things have in our experience, the significance of objects, tools, the flow of time, the self and others, as these things are and are experienced in our life world. So the life world is the field which you are going to study. That life world can be understood through the meaning that people attribute to a particular phenomena, but that meaning is socially constructed. So, for example, if you have a situation, you go to a village, the village is divided by class, by caste, by ethnicity. They look at each other differently. The attitude of those who are landed, who may also belong to the dominant caste, to the others who may not belong to the dominant class, are defined by these structural imperatives. Experience, therefore, are not disconnected from the structural. The life world is important, but this intentionality is not purely psychological. Therefore, phenomenology has to understand the social nature of experience, which range from perception, thought, memory, imagination, emotion, desire, volition to bodily awareness, embodied action, social activity, including linguistic activity. Now, if you've all heard of Husserl, the philosopher who used the word phenomenology, that these structures of experience has the element of intentionality, that is directedness of experience towards thing in the world, the property of consciousness, that it is a consciousness of or about something. This consciousness, therefore, is not like metaphysical consciousness. This consciousness is not like spiritual consciousness. This consciousness is socially constructed. The argument would be, therefore, that as a sociologist or anthropologist, when you go out to the field, you have to be aware about the world outside you. You experience it yourself if you belong to a community which practices parda, which could be a privileged community among the Muslims or a privileged community among the Hindus. That parda defines the way you look at the world. That so there is a structure, objective, but the objective entity also has subjective meaning. So the meaning of parda also may historically change. The experience of parda as something which is veiled, cut off from the patriarchal world, which could be then changed to a question of affirmation of a particular identity, and proud of affirmation of identity shifts historically, shifts structurally. So the point that I'm repeatedly telling you, it's important to look at experience, important to look at body, important to look at memory, important to look at language. But all of them are not individual practices. They are socially practiced, and therefore it should be thought of similarly. The other problem is that when our experience, like Husserl says, is directed to things or intended to things, it is not directly, it is mediated through concepts, ideas, and images. So if you are living in a society which believes in purity and pollution, your idea of purity and pollution is there in your cognitive mind, in your mind, that this is not touchable, this is touchable. This is something should not be violated, but they are also emotively felt. They are emotively felt. Your body revolts at the idea that you may have been given a food which is a taboo in your religion or in your caste. Your body actually revolts. So the idea of embodied feelings are extremely important, but it is also simultaneously important to keep aware that the body is not disconnected from the larger sense of the societal, from large macro structures like class, like caste, like race, like gender. So this consciousness has to be socially understood. Now, if I look at other theorists in sociology, say Goffman, and all of you are familiar with Goffman, the presentation of the self. And it's very interesting if you look at the writings on Goffman. He's often said that he is not a phenomenologist, but an accidental phenomenologist, because we are familiar with his focus on the self, the focus on the self and society, but he is someone who is accidental. Why does he say that? Because he does not belong to the same tradition of Husserl phenomenology, but he's drawing from that, looking at how the self operates in society. And you know that he takes the theatrical performance, the dramaturgical performance, and he looks at how individuals in works presents themselves, presents themselves and their activity in the way they guide and control them. He's described, and here in today's world, you would know how important this particular point is, because we live in times of self presentation. For example, we live even in our academic world in a world of self presentation. So it is not enough that I give a lecture today, but I must note it down and say, has it been mirrored? Has it been photographed? Has it been put off on social media? Self-presentation has acquired, what I have argued in my writings on media, an industrial scale. It is an industry, it has become a macro structure. So if you want to apply Goffman today, you have to understand that Goffman's understanding has acquired an industrial scale of representation in the days of social media. Technology and a culture of self presentation has altered the way we live our experiences, the alter the way we lie or may pick up fictitious identities in the social media. So, when we talk of phenomenology, it's not enough to understand the philosophical dimensions of the structure of consciousness, the intentionality, the importance of language, but also to see how these ideas can be applied in the contemporary times when you have a different kind of acquisition of the social media itself. Goffman's account, let's spend a little bit of time on Goffman's account of self presentation, suggests why embodied subjects adopt certain styles of ordered bodily behavior as determined by the broader social order, giving existential and social significance to the ontological structures of intercorporeal bodily communication. Following Goffman, we can suggest the embodied subject is continuously and constitutionally engaged in implicit and explicit strategies to manage how the body is presented to others. In articulating self-presentation as a feature of intercorporeality, the article uses Goffman's insight to extend Husserl and Merleau-Ponty's account of bodily communication by demonstrating that bodily communication is instantiated at the level of intercorporeality and expressed through social life with various historical, cultural, and linguistic dimension. I've quoted it in a sort of elaborate order because very often we get confused with this difficult terminology. What do they mean? Corporeal means the body. The corporeal simply means the body. Intercorporeality is how we use the body to communicate with each other, and we do it all the time. If you look at advertisements, you will notice how business people are supposed to dress up. And I see a lot of ads because I'm interested in the study of advertisements, which will say, this is your Friday attire. How do women corporates dress up in the business fashion to show their power, to show their professionalism? How do academics dress up to show that they belong to a particular kind of world? And the intercorporeal communication, therefore, is something which we all do within our universities, within our classroom, maybe within the Indian Sociological Society. So corporeal means the body. Intercorporeal bodily communication is to draw attention to the phenomenological tradition of saying how we communicate with our body, our dressing style, our way of gestures, of how we express our sense of identity as powerful or the opposite as subaltern, as showing that we are people who are deferential. How do we behave towards colonial power? How do we behave to the university powers? How do we behave towards the state, to the government, to the powers, the ministers? How do we exert ourselves in that intercorporeal bodily communication? So this is important both culturally, linguistically, and historical. For example, I've noticed increasingly in the way we communicate in our academic world, we will keep talking about honorable, respectable. Now, 40 years ago, when I was a young student, we were still very respectful to our professors, but we did not use terminological as honorable, respectable so many times, because the idea of respectability in the academia was to be familiar with the writings of our academics, our professors, our peer, rather than using terminology. So you know that these shifts in our intercorporeal bodily communication is also historically constituted, what is used and what is not used. For example, the term, say, if you belong to East India, usually we were not so familiar with the North Indian ad of G when you want to be deferential. But that becomes historically a given in more contemporary times. So we have to look at the historically constitute nature, macro structures like class, caste, gender, race, macro structures like the logic of capitalism. So the industrial expansion of, say, Facebook or Insta, or the manner that we present ourselves, that all of it come together. So the phenomenology, when we talk about the subjective or the intersubjective, it's not just about individuals or meanings which are cut off from the larger historical sense. The embodied subjectivity, therefore, does not mean just who I am as a person, because the way I speak, the way I carry myself, the way I lecture is something I have learned. I have learned from the school I went to, from the university I went to, from academics I admired, from you, maybe in today's world, the YouTube presentations that you see. This embodied subjectivity, therefore, is learned, is social. Now, if I go back to Goffman and say, what is this self-presentation? Serves as an important role in the social realm, that it ensures one presents a coherent public image where appearance and behavior are predictable and intelligible over time and across various contexts. So how I behave within my family may be a little different from the way I behave in a classroom. Though within the academia, these things tend to get blurred, and my family may protest that I speak too much like a professor, even within the family. Self-presentation, as operationalized through lived experience, is therefore reliant on key phenomenological structures. What are key phenomenological structures? I've already talked to you about corporeality, the body, intercorporeal communication, embodied subjectivity, visibility of the body, communication between bodies, and a concern with how the body is perceived by others. So we talked a little bit of Husserl, we talked a little bit of Goffman. Let's come to ethnomethodology and Garfinkel. And all of you are familiar with Garfinkel's work. Now, one thing you may notice is that a lot of phenomenologists very often focus on microspheres. It could be the study of classroom, it could be the study of a family, it could be study of a church group, it could be study of a religious sect, maybe a particular room within which a conference is being conducted. There is a deliberate reason for this focus on the micro, because you want to understand how the individual or groups of individuals present themselves and operate in their everyday interaction. So Garfinkel and the students devised the term ethnomethodology, by which they meant the investigation of the rational properties of indexical expression and other practical action as contingent, ongoing accomplishment, or organized actual practices of everyday life. In simple words, it means let us see how do we run our everyday lives. How is it that I am managing to give a talk today in our everyday interaction? How is it that the maybe the internet department of your university knows exactly how to put me on, how to let me allow? These knowledges, if you look at Giddens, would say these are covert. They're tacit knowledge. They're tacit and not explicit. So when we talk about the practical action, the rational properties of indexical expression, which ethnomethodologists use, what we mean is we take it for granted that we know how to cook. We take it for granted that I know I must go to office at 9 o'clock. We take it for granted that we have to give attendance. We take it for granted that I'll get my salary on such and such a day. We take it for granted that if we deposit a check in the bank, it will get credited. These are tacit knowledge, because if somebody tells me how does the internet work, I know nothing. If somebody tells me what is the technical background of the fact that you are being able to talk to so many people today, I would not know anything. This is a tacit knowledge which I take for granted. It is not explicit. It is not explicated. And much of the practical everyday activities is conducted by a certain implicit knowledge of how it is done. Only when you sort of destabilize it, or you debunk it, or you create a problem that people become aware about how much everyday implicit knowledge is conducted. So I'll give you a very interesting example. If any of you have read ethnomethodology, and I'm sure you have, there was an experiment which was conducted by conversational analysis, the way we talk to each other. And there was this wife who was told to experiment this on her husband. So it was after dinner, the husband and wife were talking to each other, and the wife asked the husband, "How was your day?" And the husband said, "Good as usual." And normally the conversation would have continued in that fashion. But the wife, because she was instructed to conduct an experiment to show the rational properties involved in everyday practice, she said, "What do you mean? Usual, what do you mean by good?" And he said, "Usual means usual, the way it is." He said, "No, but explain to me, what do you mean by usual? What do you mean by good?" And after a couple of conversations of this kind, the husband got very angry. And the husband said, "What do you mean? Why are you troubling me? Why are you asking me to explain what I mean by usual, what I mean by good?" And then the experimenters, the ethnomethodologists, tried to show that, look, the two of them can have a decent conversation because there is a stock of knowledge which is shared. So when he says good as usual, she knows what he means, and she pretends that she does not know. It breaks that conversation, it disrupts that conversation. So this is what is meant by indexicality, a lot of taken for granted assumptions. So when you write a check and you tell your mother, "Please sign here," and if she asks, "But why should I sign? And why aren't you signing?" and you have an argument of that kind, it brings on ridicule. It becomes irrational. Now, this experiment was to show that very often in our everyday conversation, in our everyday action, we have common sense knowledge and there is a rationality, but this knowledge is implicit, is not explicit. Whereas in sociology, when we discuss knowledge, it is explicated, it is stated out. So this was an example, again, to bring out how the ethnomethodologists drew from the idea of intersubjectivity of the phenomenologists and tried to show how this is worked out. More recently, we have worked which have looked at intersubjective engagement on the studies of violence, to religiosity, to subject and object relationship in large crowds. So you have increasingly a culturally constituted perspective to distinguish how do we interact, what is the nature of the intersubjective. I have already emphasized it, but I'd like to emphasize it again, that it's very important not to make a binary between the objective world and the subjective world. It is very important not to make a binary between what are valid positivist knowledge, which can be captured through the quantitative method. For example, how much land do you own? To the more meaningful meaning of how does a person who is very wealthy, who has a lot of land, how does it impact on his corporeal bodily behavior? So when you look at old films, you know how the king moves. The king moves in a way which demonstrates power. And when the king moves, everybody is deferential. And if you look at old imperial power, the slaves are supposed to kowtow, bow down, and be at the feet of the king. The king is omnipresent. The intercorporeal communication, visually represented, will show you the structure of that society and the historicity of that society. In a democratic society, this idea of the king as somebody separate, different, superior, more than corporeal, is actually alien to the modern societies. So you have to understand that there's a historicity to intersubjective behavior. So if you go to a particular college and you want to study the behavior of college students and how they're talking or shouting in a canteen and the intersubjectivity therein, You have to locate historically the role of a canteen in a university premise or a college premise. This is the playtime as different from the class time. These are the way which we typify the social slices which constitute our everyday life. But we do not explicate it when we talk or behave. We do not, as we talk in the canteen or joke with each other, we do not explicate. And this implicit knowledge is something which anthropologists have drawn from the phenomenological method to say what is the implicit method or the implicit meaning that they attribute. Taking the fact, if we take a little more understanding of the theory of knowledge, as most people today are aware, the knowledge is never completely neutral. And sociological knowledge is also never completely neutral. And the location of the sociologist is very important about which kind of reality we look at and what we see and what we do not see. We also know that there are dominant ideas in society which have to be played out. And we have increasingly a lot of counter narratives by people who are studying gender or who are studying subaltern caste or working class or peasantry. And they would argue that while the dominant view of society, what Dorothy Smith calls relations of ruling, are exist, but there is a possibility of subverting that or questioning that. And to understand how this is subverting is very important to see what is the implicit meaning. So, for example, even in rituals, there may be a ritual, say, which women conduct in a marriage, or which is something which is, in a certain sense, not so respectful, maybe a little obscene, maybe a little violating of the dominant hierarchies. So it's important that the phenomenologists have paid attention to the explicit dominant relations of ruling, but also to the implicit, unstated meanings which people attribute to their world. I would like to end with a little bit of Dorothy Smith, Perception of Sociology. And she has this wonderful book I would like all of you to have a look, called Everyday Life as a Problematic. That this everyday life which we look at, which we inhabit, which we conduct, is not as simple as you think it is. It is much more complex. And as sociologists, the phenomenologist approach has taught us to understand how people behave, what they conceal and what they do not conceal. What kind of meaning do they attribute to a particular phenomenon? And when we use the word meaning being attributed, you may be remembering Max Weber and his understanding of what is social action, when he says a social action has to be understood by the meaning which the actor attributes to that act. But very importantly, Weber, when he's talking about the meaning which the actor attributes to the act, is a historical actor, not the individual actor which is disconnected with society. How we behave, how we react depends upon the social context within which we live, within which we are habituated, within which we are socialized. Now, very often, this world within which we as individuals are socialized gets conflated with the sociology which we do. So, for example, if I belong to a particular class and I decide that I want to do gender, and I belong to a middle class family, and my mother never worked, and I try to write on gender and say that, look, in India, women earlier did not work. Because in my mind, implicitly, I'm thinking of my mother who did not work outside, and now women have started working. What is happening here? My consciousness is personal, developed from my own class, caste, location, and I'm attributing it, putting it as a sociological knowledge, which is false, because women in tribal societies always worked. Women worked in forestation, women worked in piggery, women worked in animal husbandry, women worked in weaving, women worked everywhere. Yet that section of women have been cognitively invisible in my mind. Smith, therefore, Dorothy Smith says, a sociology which has developed is a consciousness of society and social relation. The established sociology, which has been built over a period of 50 to 80 years in North America, depending on when you choose to date its beginning, gives us a consciousness that looks at society, social relation, and people's life as if we could stand outside them, ignoring the particular local places in the everyday in which we live our lives. Listen to this very carefully. That the dominant sociological knowledge or consciousness has given us a way of looking at society. And what is society? Society constitutes social relation and people's lives as if we can stand outside them without looking into the particular local places in the everyday in which we live our lives. So my local place could be middle class, could be to a dominant caste, could be right now as an immigrant with no really stated place of origin in Delhi city, with an academic background. This may be very different from the domestic worker who cleans my house or cooks for me, who comes from a different context altogether. Go back to the point where we begin. Yes, phenomenology talks about experience. Phenomenology talks about experience, but this experience is not a fairy tale experience. This experience is not disconnected with the social structures in which we live. The most private of our experiences are also socially constructed. How we imagine romance to be, how we imagine what should be a man or a woman, or what should be acceptance or non-acceptance of a trans person, what are our ideas of sexuality is socially constituted. So the most intimate of our experiences has a social constitution. What phenomenology has done for us is to draw attention to the fact that even when we look at experience, when we look at language, when we look at the intersubjective, that intersubjective is not something which is completely cut off, disconnected with the objective world. I'll stop over here and I hope we can make some clarifications when we can talk in our interaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your insightful deliberation, ma'am. We have a few questions in the sub box. I will be taking a few of them. We have a question from Shrestha S and a similar question from Niharika Sekya as well. We are taking one of them. The question is, ma'am, where does rationality stand when it comes to subjective studies? Should it be ignored when it comes down to experiences?
Can you just repeat? Is it there in the chat box?
Yes, ma'am. Shrestha S. Where does rationality
So where
stand?
does rationality
Yes.
stand? I'm sorry, I saw a note that I should have closed my video, but maybe now it's not too late. Yeah. So where does rationality stand when it comes to subjective studies? Should it be ignored when it comes down to experience? I'm very, very happy, Shrestha, that you've asked this question because my entire argument was to argue that there is no binary between the objective and the subjective. Okay. And the idea that objective is rational, the subjective is irrational, takes a kind of ahistorical idea of rationality. I'll give an example which is very often used. We used it even when we were students 40 years ago. Say the idea of being rational in our everyday life. So you know about population and you know the debate on population. Very often, if you belong to the middle class or upper class, you would say that poor people are so irrational because they have so many children. And middle class people and upper class people are so rational because they have few children and they have calculated that if they invest in the education of their children, they can give them better education if they have less children. Now, if you look at rationality in this sense, what we are doing is we are imposing an idea of universal rationality. A universal rationality which is irrespective of who we are. What Smith said, the particular location within which we are. Whereas for the poor person, is very rational, because the poor person has figured out that if the poor person has four children, if you look at statistics about the chances of mortality or infant mortality among the poor, the chances that two will survive if they have three is much higher. Or four, you have four children and only two survive. And if you have four children, the chances of them having extra hands, which will help you in your housework and thereby help you in your work income outside, is greater. So, from the rationality of their social location, they're perfectly rational. So, rationality is not an abstract reason. Rationality is historically constituted depending upon the subjective meanings and assessment, the implicit meaning that they attribute. The chances that the poor person, even if they pay a lot of money to send their children to school and English education and tuition, the chances that their child will drop out of school is much higher than a middle class person who's almost certain that with tuition and everything, the child will continue to pass their education. So, rationality is historical. Economic, social rationality has to be understood. There is no universal rationality which has to be imposed about, and therefore the structure of society. But if you talk about rationality as in the logical analysis in a theory of knowledge, where in social sciences we have to make sure that there is certain kind of validity and certain kind of, within quotes, objectivity in the knowledge that you have gathered from your field. So you go to your field, you collect some data, maybe even subjective ideas about people. Now, there has to be a certain validity that somebody else goes to that village, maybe 1 month, maybe 1 year, and they find a reality which is completely different. Then there is either a problem with the first study or the other. So, rationality in terms of methods, in terms of theoretical training, in order to assess whether there is a certain grounding for your knowledge, is different. So, I would not say that rationality has to be ignored. Experience can also be very rational, so the idea of experience as something which is irrational, experiences which is only subjectively felt, is different. For example, you go to a film, you go with your friends, and they're of the same age, and you see a particular scene, and all of you are very, very touched, and you have tears in your eyes. Now, somebody from a very different kind of society may not be moved to tears by the same scene, which just shows that experience or subjectively felt studies is also socially and historically constituted. I hope I've been managed to communicate the point.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, another question is from Tanya. The question is there any difference between narrative research and phenomenological research methodologies?
Yeah, this word narrative has become very popular in the last few years. When I was a student, we never heard of this idea of the narratives, And in a certain sense, it probably refers to, in anthropology or in ethnography, when you want to hear the stories of a particular respondent. So there was a particular kind, what C. Wright Mills would call abstracted empiricism, where you would administer certain kind of questions, and the questions would be close-ended, and you could either say yes or no, where obviously the voice of the respondent would be missing. So good anthropological writing or even good sociological work of all kinds of case studies would look at the way individuals narrate their stories, the way they express them. Here, language becomes very important. How the respondent speaks. For I'll give you an example again, drawn from anthropological studies, that somebody wanted to do a life story, and they went to two different kinds of field. And one was a life story of people like me, educated, academically trained, middle class, and they would ask somebody like me to tell my life story. story. And my life story would always begin, look, I was born in Shillong. I belong to a kind of background of Bengali migrants who had come there, etc., etc. I studied in so-and-so school. I went to so-and-so college. I came to Delhi to study, etc. Biographical. I got a job. I got married. I had children. And if you notice this narrative of mine, the narrative follows very much the dominant pattern of writing down, the chronological history, the birth, death, marriage at a particular point of time. It is the dominant idea of how we narrate our lives. And in the case of the middle class, educated, the way I would do research and the way I would narrate my lives come together. I don't know any other way of expressing my life story. This particular story about anthropological writing about doing a life story of a peasant in Latin America, and it could very well be in India, was, okay, tell me your life story. And if you can talk to anybody who is not literate, maybe belongs to a remote area or maybe in a village, their narratives would begin very differently. Their narratives would begin, and if you ask them where were they born, and they would never have a direct answer to where they were born. And they would say, I was born on that year when there was a big storm. And when there was a storm, this is what happened. And that storm, a mango tree fell. And the researcher would get irritated saying, tell me the year. And when was the storm? And the person wouldn't be able to express it. So the emphasis on language, which is there in any kind of research, which pays attention to narratives or to voices, does draw from phenomenological approaches, does draw upon the phenomenological emphasis on language, because we can only express through language. We can also express through our bodies when we cry, when we do not cry. Very often you would find that middle class educated people express sorrow or bereavement very differently from the wailing and crying of more traditional societies. So the body is important, but language is also important. So phenomenological approach showed the emphasis on intersubjectivity, on communication, intercorporeal communication, and the voices of the subjects located historically. So the narrative, the emphasis on narratives, data or capturing the voices is a research technique. But that research technique is impacted by a certain philosophical trend or theoretical trend of phenomenology.
Thank you, ma'am. We will be taking two more questions. One is from Yasika. Yasika asks, how can one apply methods of ethnomethodology in a research topic where one is focusing on the diasporic community or the trauma attached to the community?
No, what is on the diaspora? Okay, Yasika.
Yasika, how can one apply methods of ethnomethodology in a research topic where one is focusing on the diasporic community or the trauma attached to the community?
Okay, now this is a tricky question. Now, ethnomethodology, if you look at the way Garfinkel and his team applied, it was always in micro groups, studying a particular group, usually, in fact, even within the same room. So whether you can apply pure ethnomethodology on a diasporic community, I am absolutely unsure. But what you can do when you study the trauma of a community, all diasporic communities do not have trauma attached to them. Some do, some do not. But if you're trying to say, can you have, long, interviews with them, discussing memories or the story of intergenerational perspective, then I understand. Say, if I come from a background where our origins were in East Bengal, so when I grew up, the idea of the partition as trauma was a lived reality in our everyday lives. Okay, so how was partition remembered in different generations? Also have shifted from one point to another, and it's important to have deep, long interviews and conversations. I would drop the idea of ethnomethodology totally from it. Ethnomethodology is trying to work out the implicit understanding of how you conduct conversation. I do not think ethnomethodology is important here. What is important is the actual technique of deep conversation and also historically locating how remembered conversation. Also, in the modern societies, how you may have false narratives also becoming state narratives, which add to the idea of trauma, which may have been felt by the first generation who actually suffered the trauma. And how does the trauma get represented in next generation, in the remembered past? Becomes also an issue. But I would not suggest that ethnomethodology fits in here at all.
Okay, ma'am. At last, Sandipan Das, as well as all of us, would like to request you to share some readings to follow up to implement this perspective to research, particularly ethnography.
Yeah, ethnography is nothing to do with ethnomethodology, so they're different. Ethnography is a particular method which emerged with the beginning of social anthropology. As you know, anthropology began by the study of what were called other cultures by usually white academics from the developed world. And since they did not know the language, and since a lot of simple societies like the Trobriand Islands, maybe particular Naga communities, among which British anthropologists or American anthropologists studied, they felt that the only way to understand simple society was to live with them long periods of time, learn their language, and have participant observation. So, the best way to study ethnography or understand ethnography is to read a monograph and find out how did they actually study a particular phenomenon. More recently, when you've had what they say the native speaking back, so you would have highly educated people from the community critiquing the kind of older ethnographies, that would be different. But ethnography has also shifted in contemporary times. So you have corporates trying to do ethnography. Ethnography, basically spelled out in technique, is participant observation. You have to live and actually be present to figure out what is happening. I can't tell you of any one book or two books. If others could help me, or maybe the organizers to put in a particular text, it could be helpful.
Thank you once again, ma'am. We can see our participants are sending more queries, but we are running out of time. So we will not be able to take any more questions. I would like to request our participants to put their questions on the discussion forum, and we will end this session here. Thank you once again, Maitri ma'am, for your insightful deliberation. I'm sure it will surely help our participants in understanding this particular perspective regarding qualitative research methodology. So with this, we would like to end this session, and we will meet again at 3 p.m. for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you